Hello and welcome to another episode of The Board. I am Gavin Coughlin, Agile coach here at Boost, and I'm joined by...
Hi, I'm Jess, also an Agile coach here at Boost.
This is episode number... What episode number is this, Rebecca? 42. Wow, so today we are going to be talking about user stories, and the reason that we're talking about user stories today is it's just come up a lot for me personally over the last couple of weeks from a variety of different situations. People finding user stories difficult to write, and people misusing the term user stories a bit recently as well. And for example, I was in a pub speaking to somebody who's a new Scrum Master, and they were saying to me that user stories don't have to follow that template, it's ridiculous. And I said, well, actually they do, otherwise it's not a user story, it's something else. And it's just, I suppose, sometimes it annoys me sometimes when people get hung up about terminology, but again, if you're just going to misuse the terminology user story, people are going to get confused. So what we're going to talk about today is what is a user story, some of the common problems that you might find with user stories, and why it's difficult for some people, and the importance of breaking down your user stories. And we're going to finish up with talking about job stories, which is a concept that Jesse came across recently.
Yeah.
So, yeah, user stories. For anybody who isn't aware about user stories, I suppose we better describe what they are first of all. So a user story is a way of getting a requirement across, or expressing a requirement, and you really take that word requirement out of the situation altogether. And it's written in a template. Every single user story is written in a template, and it's expressed from the user's point of view. What's the template, Jesse?
So the template is, as a persona, I want an action so that I can achieve an expected outcome or benefit. So for example, as a new customer to an e-commerce website, I want to be able to sign up to the newsletter so that I can find out about weekly deals or any specials that might be on the site.
Yeah, and when I was first introduced to user stories, I found it just a really, really valuable thing, because we were able to really think about the end user and making sure that what we were building was actually going to benefit those users. And as many people watching will know, many people may not, it's quite easy to drop off that last bit of the template. So you might say, as a frequent visitor to Hannah's shoe store, I want to sign up to a newsletter. You might just stop there. If you can't think of the benefit, and in that case the benefit might be so I can keep up to date with daily deals and save some money. But if you can't think of the benefit at the end of the user story, you really, I find, have to revisit it and rethink about why you're actually building this in the first place. So just thinking about everything that you're building from the point of view of the person who's actually going to be using your software or website or whatever it is, I think is really, really valuable.
Yeah, and that sort of dropping the "so that" can actually be a very valuable tool for a Scrum Master to have, I suppose, coach product owners, and have conversations about, are you building this because it's actually going to benefit your end user, or are you just building it because you think Facebook integration is really cool and
yes. Yeah.
everyone's doing it, so we need it too.
Yeah, exactly. And just Kristen Donaldson has left a message. She said, "You're in a pub, no way." Yes, it was my first time in a pub. Didn't like it. Don't think I'll be back. And all user stories will have something called acceptance criteria within them as well, and they're the points that need to be met so that the developers know that the story is actually complete. It can be tested that it's complete and measured, and the product owner can look at the acceptance criteria and say, yes, check, they've complete. So for example, for the somebody signing up to a newsletter example, those acceptance criteria might be that user must supply name and email, user's details must be added to a database, user must receive a confirmation email that they have successfully signed up to the newsletter. So they might be the acceptance criteria for that story.
Yeah, I think the important thing, again, this is where sometimes people turn user stories into a big list of requirements again.
Yes. Yeah.
Acceptance criteria, again, as with all things, we want to leave solutions up to the team, and just use acceptance criteria to make sure that whatever solution they provide is meeting the value for the business. So we don't want to start saying things, again, using the newsletter example, We don't want to say it should be stored in a MySQL database using these type of fields and sends a confirmation email using X or Y tool. We want to leave those open for the team to be able to find their own solutions.
And that's right. And the people often talk about the 3 C's of user stories. 3 C's being card, conversation, and confirmation. What do they mean to you, those 3 C's?
Well, I think the conversation is the most important bit. Is not relying on the user story to cut out the conversation between the team and the product owner, because we talk a lot about individuals and interactions in Agile, and the user story is another way to encourage an interaction between the product owner and the team. And that conversation, I think, is the really most important bit in making sure that the product owner can communicate their vision to the team, and a written document is not the way to do that.
That's right. And user stories, they're never set in stone. They are there to launch a conversation, and they go through these stages of conversation, right from backlog grooming to sprint planning to your sprint review, and all the way through the sprint itself as well. So it's always been discussed. It's not just a requirement that's there set in stone and people go away and build it, and that's that.
Yeah, and again, you can have quite a big feature written as a user story with maybe 2 acceptance criteria. But as long as those acceptance criteria capture the value, and you've had a really good conversation around the story, and the team knows exactly what the product owner expects, I think that's enough.
Yeah, I did sit an exam for one of my Agile certifications before. One of the questions was, which should have more letters in it, the user story or the acceptance criteria? I thought that was a very strange question. The right answer apparently was the acceptance criteria should have more letters, but I completely disagree with that. I don't think that's I think that's nonsensical, actually. So user stories, that's basically what they are, and we've been using them for many years. And I suppose we're lucky in a situation because we are always creating sites or software and apps that people are going to be using. So it's not easy, but it's easier than it is for people in other situations for us to write stories written from the user's perspective. And I suppose that brings us on to what are some of the common problems that you find with user stories. First of all, I think people can sometimes get lazy with user stories. I think sometimes they can say, as a user, I want to, and just say user, which is very easy. It's nice to come up with a fully fleshed out persona, somebody who has certain traits that the teams understand. But a lot of people just write, as a user, I want to say sign up to a newsletter, so I can have signed up to a newsletter. And the benefit is just the action, not even reworded. I've seen that happen quite a lot, and that's just people getting lazy about writing that benefit. And these are just some of the issues I see. But I also see people find it incredibly hard to write user stories when they're in certain situations.
Yeah, I think one thing that people do find, or sometimes find hard from the product owner side, is when they have, when they're writing a user story and they're thinking about a really large feature, they can sometimes struggle they just write sort of a long letter of a user story that kind of rambles along, and they're not really sure of the exact benefit. And those can often, I suppose, ambiguous user stories are also, we're talking about succinct, really well structured user stories as being great, but you can get these really long, rambling, very unclear user stories as well.
It's like that, to paraphrase a Mark Twain quote, I didn't have the time to write you a short letter, so I wrote you a long one instead. It's sometimes easier to ramble on than to keep things a little bit succinct. And I do see people struggle with user stories if they're, for example, a team that's largely concentrating on infrastructure or something that the user isn't really going to see themselves. It's really difficult to write a user story when you're in that situation.
Yes, yeah. So I'm working with a team, and we've been on a project, I think it's now 6 years old, and we've been running Scrum for that entire 6 years. And we do, in those situations, I suppose we do a little bit what you talk about, of just sort of writing as a user, I want stable infrastructure.
Yes. Yeah.
Where, you know, that's not really, as a user, they don't really care about that, and there's not a clear benefit, but I suppose we find that keeping those things in user stories helps the team manage the work.
Yes. Yeah.
And they're not a regular occurrence in the sprint.
Just another question here. Do more detailed specs have their place in story creation?
I think it depends on what the specs, what you're talking about. If you are interfacing with an API or doing some sort of integration, I mean, obviously there needs to be some, I don't know that it needs to be an acceptance criteria per se.
I think sometimes you see attached to stories, say you have something that has to talk to an API, you might have some of the specs attached to the story for reference from the team. And I've seen stories as well which might have some just high level UI work done on it as well, attached to user story. And I think in that situation it's okay, but yes, not to list out all these specifications as acceptance criteria. No.
Yeah, and often, you know, those specifications are implied by an acceptance criteria.
Yeah.
You know, if you were trying to think of an example of an API integration that you might be using, so say for example you're using Google to do all your user management, and the user can update their details in your app. If your acceptance criteria were all changes are reflected in the user's Google account, then you could spec out exactly what needs to be sent to Google and what needs to come back. But that first acceptance criteria, if that happens, what's the point in all the other specs? So yes, it does have its place if it's, but we tend to use attachments to the stories or something like that to keep those sort of more detailed specs rather than acceptance criteria.
And the interesting thing about user stories that is worth mentioning as well is that it's not specified to be used in Scrum. It's just people choose to use it, and sometimes people feel like, oh, we have to use user stories, but you don't have to use user stories. If you really want to try something else, absolutely try something else. Whatever actually works for you, it helps you to work in an agile way. Just for us, we find that user stories are really useful. One of the other common problems that I find is people having difficulties breaking down user stories. That's probably the biggest issue I see people having, and it's a really difficult one. If they have a job that's going to take somebody 4 weeks to do, they think that cannot be broken down. And this is a really common thing that when we work with new teams, they invariably think, none of these stories can be broken down. And I'm sure a lot of people who are watching know, but for those who don't, the INVEST model is something that's really useful. It's an old acronym in Agile, but it's I think still a very, very useful and valid one. So the INVEST acronym is I for independent. Try to keep those stories dependencies out of them if possible. They're all negotiable, N for negotiable, so you should be able to talk about them and they're not set in stone. V, they should be valuable. Each story should create some value. Estimable, E for estimable, they have to be estimated by the team. If they can't be estimated, something wrong with it. S, they should be small, really important, so they can actually be completed within a sprint and flow through the sprint. And T for testable, you have to be able to test them. And that acronym's been around for a while, and it's hard to make a story fit in all there. It's not always possible to make your stories independent. Just in a perfect world, try to make them independent.
And I think, I suppose that's occasionally where you have that conflict of having independent stories and small stories, is people are trying to make their stories independent, so they include all the dependencies in one story, but that makes it really large. And what I tend to find is the team often has the ability to break down stories really easily. If the product owner can provide their overall value proposition in one large story, then the team often knows how to say, all right, well, why don't we do this little bit first and that bit second, and then the third bit after that. And unfortunately, yeah, those three stories will be dependent on each other. But like you say, it's very hard to have that invest model all the time.
I think it's more important to have it small than independent if you choose one over the other. That's just my personal opinion, because you want stories to be able to be completed and accepted within a sprint, or else it's going to just fall apart a little bit and people are going to get demoralized. And people sometimes say, how small should you break down a story? Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, there's some common sense applied there. You don't want to get too granular. But if a story is longer than, say, 1/6 of a sprint, you might want to look at that and think that's going to be problematic. And if you really don't think it's going to fit into a sprint, well, it absolutely has to be broken down.
Yeah, so the same team I was talking about before, we have a rule that's sort of loosely applied that no stories come into the sprint that are greater than 5 points. It was, and preferably 3 is our maximum. And that's worked really well for us. The product owners understand why, and the team. It's just, so we're a relatively small team, and we worked out that a 5 is approximately one person for pretty 3/4 of the sprint. And if there was any variation in the story, if it was slightly bigger than a 5, then we got into massive trouble and had no hope of finishing the sprint. And often larger stories, there is more uncertainty with them just because of the size of the work. So you are more likely to have that underestimation. So we try and break those down wherever possible.
Yeah, and people do find it very difficult to break down user stories, and there's many different ways to do it. Whatever makes sense to you. Sometimes you look at the acceptance criteria and they can be broken out as separate stories. Sometimes certain jobs might have workflow steps that you can break stories down into. Sometimes there's business rules surrounding those things that can help you break them down. There's quite a few different ways. There's actually a very good article about breaking down user stories with a flowchart attached, which we'll add the link to the bottom of live stream for you. It's pretty useful. That's user stories, but recently you've come across a different concept, I suppose, which is moving away from user stories a little bit. We haven't actually put it into practice ourselves, so it's just, for us, it's just a concept we thought was worth discussing.
Sharing. Yeah, I mean, so as we've said before, lots of people do struggle with user stories, and sometimes, it's not the only way to break things down. So I came across an article by Alan Clement on Medium, and we'll again post the link on live stream after this. And he was talking about a new concept, job stories, and covered that out quite succinctly in his article. So the assertion with job stories is that user stories make too many assumptions. So you have a persona, so the as-a, which, again, unless you've done lots and lots of market research, is probably your best guess at what your users are like.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so there's an assumption there, and then the I want a is another assumption. So what he says is those two assumptions leave way too much ambiguity in actually delivering value to your users. So the job stories take a slightly different approach and focus on events. So when something happens, I want something else, and that captures your motivation. So why you're building the feature, and then so that I can get an expected outcome.
So it's similar to user stories in a way. It still has that template. It's just that rather than as a user I want to so I can, it's when I want to so I can.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and what about that removes the ambiguity? Why does a contextual situation remove ambiguity that a persona may cause?
Well, I suppose by using an event, you're removing, you know that these events happen within your system. So for example, when a user forgets their password, they want to, so that they can get an outcome. You know that this is happening. You're not making an assumption about who that person is or what they what the background to that person is. I suppose I think it could be a lot easier for people to write those stories.
Yeah.
Because you're talking about events. So I think for product owners, it could be a useful tool.
Interesting. Yeah. My only concern about that would be that you are getting away from thinking about the benefit to the users. You're thinking about situations, which is obviously easier to do. And if you had a wish list of features, you could quite easily think up situations of those and the outcomes of those situations. But if you had a wish list and had to think about users and the benefits to those specific users, that's a lot more difficult, possibly more valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually really interesting in the article, Alan sort of says personas provide too much ambiguity. But in a lot of the examples, he uses persona-like wording.
Yes.
So when a customer does something or when a seller does something else. So I think you definitely can still include personas in there.
He does mention that these have to come out of interviews with people. And you can't really come up with a job story without actually interviewing people about some of these situations. Which is interesting because you could interview people for user stories, but I do like the idea about interviewing people and getting real contextual situations out of that. I think that's quite useful, and I do see how job stories might be better used, or of more use for a team that's in a purely infrastructure space than actually creating software for end users. It might be better for that sort of situation, because you do see some stuff shoehorned into user stories when it seems a little bit crazy. Like, why are we sticking to this template? It doesn't really seem relevant.
Yeah, I mean, again, infrastructure would be a great use of job stories.
Yeah.
So, when server 1 dies, I want to know that the rest of our website won't go down, so that we can maintain a reliable service.
Yes.
Taking out that persona in that situation would be really useful. And I suppose maybe what I might look to try to start with is writing job stories for infrastructure type work, and keeping the persona and user stories for user focused work could be one way to.
Yeah, and just to refer back to my pub conversation a while back, that person who was talking about user stories, they had really started writing job stories without really calling them job stories, and they were saying that these are user stories, and that just stoked my ire a little bit, because it wasn't user story, and it's just people throwing around terms willy-nilly a little bit. But yeah, they had really naturally fallen into writing job stories, and it seemed to be working for them. And I mean, user stories are there to help people create value with each bit of work that they do, and I think that's something that you really have to keep in mind every time you're working on a piece of functionality, a feature, or whatever it is you're actually working on. And if you can keep that in mind when you're writing job stories, that you're still trying to create some actual business value or user value there, then it's okay. And my only concern would be that people write job stories because they're easier and they don't have to think so much about the value. It's just too easy to manipulate them into, your wish list.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as with anything, it's give something like this a go. But again, try if you're working in a Scrum environment, remember that the goal of your sprint is to produce a potentially shippable product at the end of it. If job stories help you do that, then great. If they don't, then user stories might be what works for you. I think the one great thing about user stories is it does force you to take that slice that thin slice
Yes,
of product
yeah.
that you're trying to deliver. Whereas, like you say, you could just build sort of really disparate features using job stories.
You could apply, say, if you're working in a waterfall way, you could apply job stories to it really quite easily, and nobody would know the difference.
Yeah, well, I
The same
mean,
way.
I suppose they are in quite a use case
Yes, yes.
sort of template. So, yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Okay, so I think the job story idea is really interesting, and I know that we're probably going to try them out here, and be really interested to see how that goes, and we'll let you guys know how that goes too. If it's a huge success or a massive failure, we will let you know.
Or somewhere in the middle.
Or somewhere in the middle, yeah. So that's us for this episode. See you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks very much for watching.
Cheers.